for a discussion around that sort of topic area. So if there's anything that comes up, and I'm not very good on the dialogue box, but Nick will pick up with it. And if you can just throw stuff out as we go, that would be really helpful. So title of today's webinar is Mastering the Fundamentals, Planning for Throws in a Club Setting. So it's really recognising that you're probably going to be working for the benefit of what I'm trying to do here with a group of young throwers who are at the stage where they are starting to concentrate on throws as their chosen discipline within athletics, but it doesn't mean exclusively that's where they're going to be. So trying to think about a number of people you're working with, and this is kind of a foot inside and a bigger foot outside, if you like, of COVID. So we're not looking to try and just do things in the COVID setting. We're trying to think perhaps further down the line there might be stuff that you can pick up with this in terms of the activities and what can be done. So I apologise in advance, but there is going to be some sort of technical language in here because some part of my job is coach education. I try and not make that too cumbersome, but I think just to frame and put a skeletal framework about what we're trying to do, it's worth introducing some of that stuff. If you don't sort of get it or it doesn't make any sense to you as you go, don't worry, because the rest of it is kind of standalone, but it's set in the context of some of the theory that surrounds planning. Right, so by the end of this seminar, we should have ideas about planning for throws. We should have a strategy to work through the winter season and build better athletes, and have a strategy to work through the winter season and build better throwers. So we're trying to achieve those things, and by the end of this session, hopefully we'll have at least covered some of those, if not all of them. I have to make some assumptions here that you know your athletes, or you have some idea of the athletes you're working with and what they may bring to your sessions in terms of their anthropometrics, so like the length of their levers and how they have different skill sets. You've also got some idea of their commitments outside of athletics, because obviously the training we do has to be set in the context of their total life commitment. So they may be playing 3 other sports during a week, or they may have a heavy day at school, those sort of things, and have some understanding of the strengths and weaknesses. Now, I've not put their strengths and weaknesses for a reason. It's a bit cumbersome in terms of the English, but strengths and weaknesses of so many things. So the strengths and weaknesses are us as coaches, the strengths and weaknesses of the facilities you've got, the strengths and weaknesses of the athlete you're working with, the strengths and weaknesses of perhaps the person who's with them and how they turn up there, all those things. So understanding all the things that are in your favour and all the things you're working against, because undoubtedly you'll be trying to overcome some problems in your coaching, whether it be facilities or support or equipment, whatever it might be. So understanding the strengths you have and the weaknesses you have as a coach will also be part of our coaching journey. Right, so some of the technical language we're going to look at, and it's not too complicated, but we'll go with it, is that we generally speaking for young athletes, you'd only plan for 1 full year as a macro cycle. So the term macro cycle you see in various texts, and if you were training for an Olympics, the macro cycle might be over 4 years, but with young athletes and people who are entering the event group, macro cycle could be considered to be a full year from September, when the season usually would have finished, and through to the August when the season does finish. So that's 1 full year. And then within that, there's broken down into smaller blocks of a mesocycle. So macro meaning big, meso meaning medium, if you like. And that may be up to about 3 months of training with a particular theme. And then you have microcycles, and they're usually a week. So there's, 52 weeks in the year, and you'll be training for most of those weeks, but not all of them. And then within that week, the microcycle, there are sessions that make up that microcycle. So I'll try to keep it as simplistic as I can. So the length of those training sessions probably between 1 and 2 hours, and you may possibly, if you're lucky, have 2 sessions a week, but we don't assume that to be the case. So this is some of the terminology that you'll come across in your work as a coach in England and the home nations. Is the idea that you have a series of activities and exercises, if you like, that prepare the athlete to be able to compete in the summer. So if it's a situation where there's no an indoor season, so with the exception of shot, which may have an indoor season, we're just assuming you're going to train from the winter, which starts, if you like, in September through to the start of the season, which would probably be in April. So at the bottom of that pyramid, if you like, is this broad base of general preparatory exercises. So in that, we're talking about all the stuff that you do that actually is focused on the athlete, to getting the athlete as physically fit as they possibly can be. Don't wish to enter into the discussion about fitness necessarily, because there's different types of fitness, but aerobically fit, strong and robust as they can be. And then moving on to that, you get a bit more specialized and do some preparatory exercises that are aimed at building particular attributes you'd like to throw in. And then specific development exercises are actually things that replicate the throw but aren't the throw itself. So if you like, I don't know, throwing a weighted ball, if you're throwing discus instead of throwing a discus itself, and obviously the competitive exercises, the actual events we do. All right, so full turns, full approach if you're doing javelin. So there is this pyramid that you might be aware of, and if you're not aware of it, we'll revisit some of that as we go. So don't worry too much about the theory behind that, because we would definitely cover it as we get through it. So looking at the macro cycle, which is the whole year, we'd really, generally speaking, if you're trying to do something in terms of a planning cycle, if you like, you'd start really at the end of that period. And if the winter period, is probably talking about starting in April and looking about what you're going to have achieved from September, October, November, December, January, February, March, and April. And then obviously the season itself will follow on April, May, June, July, and August. And then you're back into the next cycle. So looking at what we're going to do. So the winter season, generally speaking, we look forward to planning is not the whole year, but it's from September through to April the following year. So you know that as you approach the season, the athletes need to be in competitive mode. They need to be physically and mentally and technically prepared for that start to the season. So generally speaking, you'd want to look at what you need to have achieved by that point and work backwards in order to achieve it. So you want to say they've got to be technically better, they've got to be physically more robust, and they've got to be mentally prepared to be able to throw. And then you can really start looking at what you need to do to be ready to achieve that. So one of the things that we sometimes overlook in athletics is what do you need to do to be ready to train? Because I think sometimes people would assume that training itself is enough. But in throw-ins, we should really spend some time getting ready to train. So if this is my year overview, and this is how I actually do mine, so I've lifted this from one of the plans I have for athletes myself. I set out an Excel spreadsheet and I go, April is when we're going to be, late March, early April is working on, concentrating on trying to really replicate those competitions and do some work to that. But if I go back to September, assuming that the season finished in August, I'm going to spend a block of time in September getting my athletes as fit as they possibly can be. So bearing in mind, throwers may be quite large and they sprint across a fairly small circle, either 2 and a bit meters or 2.5 meters wide, or most have to run in javelin 30 meters. We're not talking about athletes that have to have great endurance. But during that period of time in September, a huge amount of effort with my groups are spent getting as fit as they possibly can. And we're going to look at that in a minute. So we're going to go through. So if you look at this, I'll plan my year out. So we've got, for the group of athletes I coach, getting fit in September. Then we do a block of concerted effort that's working on strengthening their weaknesses, consolidating their strengths, building on something technical. We have reviews of that going through, but you can see also I've tried to indicate there that the purple bits on those blocks is a rest week. So we do 3 weeks of fairly hard training and have a rest week. A rest week doesn't mean you do nothing. It just means you have a much lighter week. Then 3 weeks of intense training, a rest week. 3 weeks of intense training, a rest week. Now, if you're like I do, I try and have a rest week around the Christmas week, because if you don't, you tend to lose that week anyway because facilities are closed. So some of your planning is perhaps needs to be geared to what you can access and what you can't access. So that's how I plan stuff out. So the first part is getting as fit as I possibly can. So I've tried to color code the rest of the presentation. So the orange bits to do with the getting fit bit, the green bits to do with sort of the blocks in between, and the blue bits to do with working it specifically for the start of the season. So getting fit, preparing the athletes for training. So in this time, perhaps October may come into it. Some people start a bit later, give their athletes a bit longer break. I definitely, obviously this season's running a lot later, so the fitness work will be done later than would ordinarily. But at the start of the winter training, you have to get your athletes fit to train. So this is a period of time when they are doing stuff that you may recall from your own childhood. So dare I say, things like circuit training, general fitness work on balance coordination, getting as fit as they possibly can. They'll be building endurance for them to be able to train for longer with more quality later in the season. The question is, what does that look like? So what does it look like? It's usually a period of high volume and lower resistance. We're not really putting much resistance into this. We're doing high repetitions, somewhere between 10 and 20 repetitions, perhaps for somewhere between 3 and 5 sets, using a body weight, medicine balls, bands, bags, something like that. I use with some of my athletes is empty water cylinders. So, like for example, one of the athletes I've got has got an AdBlue. There's 10 litres. 10 litres weighs roughly 1 kilo per litre, so 10 litres, 10 kilo weight. But the good thing about that is swashes about a bit, and it creates an instability he has to resist. And so we're building what people will call farmer's strength. This is all the stuff that you sort of associate with fitness. So things like press ups, squats, various planks. And I don't like a static plank necessarily. I like to be able to work in variations around that. Abdominal work, circuit training, running. One of my favorite exercises for my athletes is 6 times 150 with a walk back recovery on the track. And I do 3 sets of 6 times 150. It's painful. I'm not making any excuse for that. The kids hate it, but they always talk about it later on in the year when they benefited from it and look back with sort of fondness about the fact they even achieved it. So there is actually quite an important part in that, in a sensible way, to have your athletes suffer some discomfort because they know what it's like to suffer a little bit, but the improvements are there to see. But also it toughens them up. So things like swimming, cycling, bear crawls, mountain climbing, farmers walks, tire pulling, running hills, relay variations. So relays around local park over different terrains. Dare I say, we've done cross country in the past, activity games, and basically your imagination. As long as they're moving, they're out of breath, and they're working on different energy systems. So obviously, as throwers, we work mostly the ATP, CP cycle, alactic system, very short bursts of time. But at this time, we're working the aerobic system. So they need to be out of breath, and the anaerobic system, they need to be out of breath and hardly able to talk. So a variation of different energy systems come into that. So I've put up in the top corner of the icons there a picture of a heart, because you're really working here on cardiovascular fitness. Right, so once your athletes are as fit as they possibly can be, you then move into stuff that's a bit more like throwing training. So probably don't have any contact with an implement for that period of getting fit. You may throw stuff, but you're not be throwing a discus shot or a hammer or a javelin. You'll be throwing a medicine ball or a bag or a cylinder, or something that will involve a different sort of throwing. So very, very, very little, if any, contact during that period of time with the implements. But now you're moving into what I've called block 1 and 2, and they will have similar things in them. So I'm not going to be too specific about what goes into block 1 and block 2, but you're looking at trying to improve the strength, mobility, and speed of your athlete. Repetitions may vary here, but you're going to have much lower repetitions, and that depends on the resistance or the loading. And I say resistance or loading, it doesn't necessarily mean weights. It could be bands, or it could be balls, or it could be bags. So please don't assume it's weights room. But similarly speaking, you're probably only going to be doing somewhere between maybe up to 8 reps, so somewhere between 5 and 8 reps maybe per set, and maybe do 5 sets of 5 or something like that. A lot of the work you can do here looks much more like run, jump, and throw. So stuff that you may have done with movement skills or physical preparation. I'm going to plug that quite heavily throughout this, and it's a really good course online, and the actual practical course of physical preparation is very well worth attending. Reps will be much higher in some of the run, jump, throw stuff, but the resistance load-based stuff will be probably only, say, between 5 and 8. There is an emphasis on multi-throw, multi-jump, and running drills. So don't worry about that if you don't know what that means. I'm going to show you a couple of slides where it shows that. And during this time, you're working on technique work, which is trying to make those major changes. Generally, the rule of thumb, as we know from coaching throws, you're not going to make a drastic change to the middle of the season, because sometimes they have to get worse to get better. And if you're not careful, you end up making a complete mess of the season. So we tend to make huge technical changes during the winter months. If I've got spelling errors in there, I'll skip over them. I'll pretend they're right, but I haven't spell checked this, so I do apologise. So what does the block look like? So you're going to be doing things like hurdle mobility drills, so under and over hurdles, jumping, stick. So it's not stick as in you're jumping over a stick. So landing and sticking the landing. So you're not, taking several jumps after it. So that's quite important. Jumping for distance, jumping for speed, jumping in multiple directions, double-footed, single-footed. Then the similar thing with throws, heave, sling, pull and push, all important parts of throws, multi-directional throws, unilateral, bilateral throwing, running for speed, running for reps, running drills. So some of the stuff you see sprinters doing, there's no reason, absolutely no reason why that shouldn't be the repertoire for a throws coach. And maybe in this section for older athletes, they might be doing, if they were doing weights, things like cleans, squats, snatch and bench press. And of those exercises, probably the cleans and squats and snatch would be much more preferable to bench press. It's not something that we necessarily believe is a good way to go, because the first three are total body lifts, whereas bench press is obviously only the upper body. So total body lifts, and a lot of the other stuff is also total body work too. So if you look at the multi-jump stuff, there's loads of stuff here, and I won't go through all of this slide, and I've got another one that follows, which is multi-throws, but multi-jumps, looking at the underpinning movements of single leg and double leg squat patterns, lunge patterns, and I'll talk about some of those movements because they're quite important as we go. So the basic movements we'd expect to see embraced and improved throughout the period of this training of, if you like, the block 1 and block 2. So there's a load of lists of stuff on there that you do, but obviously as you go towards the top of the pyramid, it's far more demanding, if you like, and it's not necessarily that you go there with a group of young throwers, but certainly the bottom two underpinning movements and jumps in place, and multiple jumps, maybe hops and technique that would go with skips and bounds up to that level. But you wouldn't necessarily go to box jumping necessarily, or hurdle jumps, until they're able to progress to that level. By able to progress, we have the phrase which will appear again later in the program about earning the right to progress. And as coaches have said in the previous things, we've got to be brave enough to regress the movement if they're not ready to do that. But all these things are just about building that physical robustness and the explosion needed to throw something a long way. And again, for the multi-throw stuff, looking at, again, the legs being engaged in the throw, obviously, squat patterns, lunge patterns coming again, about single leg throws, obviously having a base of support that changes, about having it within, if you like, the base of support and outside the base of support, throwing in multiple directions, part of the throws, absorbing the weight of whatever's coming back at you is also quite important, because that's about bracing. So if someone throws you a ball, rather than knocking it back off your feet, that bracing movement is quite important to us as throwers. So force absorption and generation is really quite important in some of those movements. And of course, all those things can be quite fun, like throwing medicine balls to each other, as long as it's done safely. So again, I'm going to leave that there, and that will come in the presentation. I don't wish for it to be distracting, because I want actually to try and get in and ask me some questions and trying to share some stuff within the group. So what does throwing look like in block 1? Because all the things we've gone there is sort of general work you're going to be doing, or more specialized work, if you like, that's just really about developing the robustness of the athlete, about building their physical attributes. And what does throwing look like in this block is you're really looking at trying to do stuff based on technique and those major changes that will come. But it will also be explosive and relevant to the event, because you may not be just throwing the implement. You could be mimicking the implement by using such things as a weighted ball or a bar, or a heavier weighted implement or a lighter weighted implement. You might be throwing a bag, or you might be doing something that's going to be encouraging the movement pattern, but isn't necessarily going to be the throw itself. So, for example, athletes I worked with in the past throwing a discus, instead of throwing a discus, they'd throw a weighted bar, so a long bar, because it gives them a greater sense of where the orbit is when they turn, and it also gives them a sense of where their delivery is as well. So, and again, you can vary the weight of the bar. It can be heavier or it can be lighter. You'll see even things that people have, things like a Denfrey tool, which is like a small shot on the end of a chain, which again puts the center of mass of the implement further out than it would normally be, and then it gives you a different sensation in terms of your awareness of where your arms and your torso is during the throw. So throwing during this time will involve throwing the discus, javelin, the shot and the hammer, or the club if you're working with disability athletes, but it also will include throwing other stuff in a mimicry way. So you might be using some implement, but it may that even the implement might be heavier, but it could look the same, but it's not necessarily just going to be wholly rooted in throwing the competitive weight during that time. It also, during this time, some of the throwing work you do, the technical work, will be broken down into drills. So you'll be doing part of the throw, repeating part of the throw, and you'll be drilling that perhaps with the implement, perhaps without the implement, perhaps with a different implement, perhaps with something that may emphasize the movement they need to make. So lots of stuff that we do here is trying to find a way through to get our athletes to understand the technique better. So I did a previous webinar on the back of the circle. So lots of times at the back of the circle, they've just been doing drills on that. I like my athletes to drill with the discus in their hand, even if they're not going to throw it, simply because that's how they will be doing it in real time. So to throw in, 1.5 kilos for an under 17 boy, it's, if they're not careful and they do it with the weight, in my mind, they don't get the balance of it right, because of 1.5 kilos on the end of your arm creates a different balance. But that's personal preference, and it's not hard or fast, because lots of coaches do very well by not doing that. So some of the examples of the throwing exercise you might do: full turn with a weighted bar or a Denfrey tool if it's discus, throwing underweight implements. So hammer throwers are usually very good at this, throwing underweight implements and overweight implements. And similarly speaking with hammer throwers, they throw stuff off a short wire and a long wire to get those different sensations and the generation of speed and the acceleration that's required to throw something a long way. So multiple turns, balance drills, approach work in the javelin with assistance and with resistance. So with assistance, you might ask them to travel quicker, and in so doing, you might get them to run assisted by a bungee, so they're being dragged along a bit quicker. Or they might do it with resistance against the bungee, or dragging a tyre with the javelin, but obviously not throwing, and dragging the tyre, so they're working the ground, they're clawing the ground away from them. General ball throwing in javelin, ball throwing in most events. Standing throw, if the athlete's able to do a full turn, you might want to break down and do a standing throw and work on the basics there of maybe the block or brace. And again, that doesn't necessarily have to be with the implement. So lots of things that can be done with specific development exercises that don't actually involve necessarily throwing the implement. We're just trying to mimic that throw or some part of that throw with either resistance or assistance to get them to understand and perhaps build strength in a certain aspect. That makes sense. Right, so then we go from those blocks. I'm not going to talk about the 2 blocks too much until we get a bit further on. So getting ready to compete. So during this time, after they've done all the preparatory work and they're more physically robust and their technique has been consolidated into the new and improved technique we've been working so hard to do during the winter season, is now we're really just trying to prepare them for the actual competitive event. The emphasis here, of course, is if you're throwing stuff, that chances are you'll be doing nearly all of your throws with a competition weight implement. It'll be more like competition than it will be more like training. So they'll be doing some work, literally staying in the circle will be quite important. Going through the rubric or the repertoire of what they do before they throw in a competition. You might even want to build in, as you're heading near this time, a big break between throws. So getting an athlete used to waiting 20 minutes to throw rather than taking 6 throws in the space of 6 minutes. They take, perhaps, if you can spare the time, 1 throw over 20 minutes, because it's quite important to be able to manage that time. So getting ready, you become much more specific about what you're doing, and the volume of throws will be probably less than you do during the winter, but the intent to be far more. So you'll be throwing at full speed. You'll be trying to throw with the implement at full pelt in a competitive way. So lots of the stuff you'll do as you head towards the season, and the last 4 or 5 weeks will be geared towards competing. So the heavy work is done, the load's starting coming off, but the intensity of the throwing goes up and the volume of the throws perhaps goes down. Right, and similarly speaking, lots of people, if you hear coaches, and certainly the coaches I worked with when I was growing up, is always finish on a good one. We're talking about here about quality and rather than quantity, and we're talking about going away with a feeling that sort of, if you like, that memory you're going to go away, your muscle memory, if you like, to remember the good throw you had and how technically proficient it was. Right, so now what we're doing is that's the general overview, and we're now going to try and look at planning a 4-week block of training. So within your planning, there is a situation here where you're really going to have to think, I can't imagine going in to do anything that you do in life generally that you don't either have it planned roughly in your head, or better still, planned precisely in your head, and you want to achieve something at the end of it. And coaching throws and planning training is no different to that. So the skills you already have. But what I would like to think you could do to help you along the way here is to try and think, what goals do you have for that block of work? So if it's a 4-week block of work, what movement skill goal do you want from them? What technical skill goal do you want from them? And what physical attribute goal you want from them? So you might have 3 goals that you may need to address during this block, and then you can plan the sessions around it. So I've given you an example here. So these are my example goals. What goals do we have for that block? So I want my athlete to improve her squat and lunge patterns. So they're the 2 things, the 2 movements, going back to this, what movement skills goal do I have? The 2 movement skills I want her to improve are her squat pattern and her lunge pattern. All right, so I'll talk about other stuff later on, but that's what I'm going to try and concentrate on her for the period of this 4-week block. And then I'm saying her technical situation, so going back to the previous one, what technical skill do I want to achieve? I want her to develop the entry at the back of the circle. So she's not getting enough tension in her left adductor and a turn of her left foot. You know, she's not pushing her knee out the back away from the direction of the throw to get that tension, to have a wide right leg. That's where we're going to spend. So we're going to spend most of the time working on that at the back of the circle. And the other attribute I'd like to get, which is a physical attribute goal, I'd like to try and improve her explosiveness. So what parts of the session do we have to be able to achieve that? So we've got those 3 goals, and then we've got, I'm trying to make it simple here, we've got 3 different things that we've got within our session. We've got the warm-up, we've got the circle time or run-up time, and you've got the time away from the circle or the run-up. And then the other one I've skipped here to make it simplistic is you've got the cool-down. But so these are the main parts of the activities: the warm-up, the time you spend in the circle, and the time away from the circle. So planning a 4-week block, the first thing we're saying is the warm-up. Now, you've come across this before, and if you have, I make no apology for repeating it. So the warm-up should be based about the concept of ramp. So raise heart rate, muscle temperature to activate the muscles in the nervous system, mobilize the joints, and potentiate. So RAMP, raise, activate, mobilize, potentiate. Potentiate sounds a bit grandiose, but simply just doing something that replicates the movement. You know, to potentiate, some people throw, for example, a heavier implement to get ready to be able to do the activity properly. So, you know, they throw in a 4 kilo shot in competition. They may do some exercise heaving a 6 kilo shot or a 5 kilo shot to get used to that movement against some resistance, and therefore when the real activity comes, it may be easier for them. Similarly speaking, they might want to be working on something else, and they might throw a lighter implement because they want to feel that sensation of speed. But potentiate really to do something that replicates the movement you're going to be doing when the training starts. So the task I want here to think about, and I don't know if we could get some comments in the comment box, if that's possible, which of our goals can be easily accommodated into a ramp warm-up? So our goals are to improve the squat and lunge patterns, to develop entry at the back of the circle, and improve explosiveness. Which one of our goals can be easily accommodated into a ramp warm-up? Give you a chance to think about that, and if you can throw something into the comment box, brilliant. If I can read it, that'd be even better. And just think about what you could achieve that, because I think what I'm saying here, in fact, I am actually saying it, is that the warm-up is often an overlooked part of training. A lot of work can be done during a warm-up. If you think if a warm-up takes, even call it 15 minutes, and you've got 4 sessions in a month minimum, so that's an hour's extra work you can do if you consider the warm-up to be an integral part of progressing your athlete rather than warming up for the sake of it. So which of our goals could be easily accommodated into the ramp warm-up? Well done, Spencer, who appears late in this, masquerading as Nick Ridgeon. So developing the squat and lunge patterns via the mobilization section around warm-up, I would agree. So one of the things we perhaps overlook, and I'm going to say something here which you all hopefully will think about, is that I often ask the question of people who are coaching, and I'm trying to develop coaches as part of work I do, is when do you start coaching your athletes? Well, I start coaching my athletes as soon as they walk towards the circle or wherever we're meeting. I'm looking at making an assessment of how they're walking, what they look like, are they tired, do they look like they've got an injury, all those things. Quite important. But when you get there, of course, you can ask those questions, you can be more sure about it. But if you're looking to try and use the time you've got, which is quite precious with them, and you've got 15 minutes to warm up, why can't we develop our movement patterns really sincerely during that time? Because if you do squats and you do them in a decent squat pattern, or you do lunges in a decent lunge pattern, then you are going to get warm. And it doesn't, therefore, you're required to do the old stuff of let's do 2 laps at the track and do some static stretching, because that must be a thing of the past. So what can we do during our ramp warm-up? We can certainly do squat and lunge patterns. Now, the reason why you want to do that is because there's lots of things you can do in those patterns. So I'll just put down some of the things you can do here, and not suggesting that you have to have weights and bars to be able to do this, even though the 2 icons suggest that. But body weight squat, a front squat, a back squat, a goblet squat if they've got a medicine ball, or even a kettlebell handy. Overhead squat can be done with a broomstick, a single leg squat, a squat and calf raise, a squat and jump, all variations on squats. But really important that we have that as that mobilization section of the warm-up. So mobilizing around those joints and making sure that they're ready to throw properly means that you've got to be able to do a decent squat, and you've got to be able to do a decent lunge. Again, alternating lunges, dumbbell lunges, rear lunges, side lunges, lunge around the clock, a kneeling lunge. All of those things could be integrated into the warm-up. And so they don't have to come for the 4-week block and go, I've got to do, 5 sets of 12, body weight squats every week. So the first week they come in and maybe do 5 sets of 12 body weight squats, or they might do 3 sets of 10 or some other number, or they might do 5 followed by 10 followed by 15 but of course the next week they come and do a different squat. So they could do a single leg squat, or they could do squat and calf raise, or squat and jump. All right, so as long as there's something built in to improve their squat pattern, and as long as they're able to progress to those slightly more demanding types of squat, then so be it, and let's move on to it. But of course, we are coaching their warm-up. They're not just warming up on their own. You're looking for those movement patterns. You're making sure that the technique involved in those things are done properly. So there's good time in warm-up to develop their movement patterns. So planning a 4-week block, and if it were the case, you're going to maybe do squat and lunge, but some movements you'd expect to plan for and maybe build into the next sessions. You do squat and lunge in the first 4 weeks, and then hinge and brace in the next 4 weeks, and then push and pull. And of course, you're still going to introduce squat, lunge, hinge, brace, because it's a cumulative building. So they can, they might be able to push and pull, but they still need to be able to squat, lunge, hinge, and brace. So all of those movements are important, and we really would want to be seeing those introduced into their warm-ups. Again, the one twist down there and brace are kind of key for us as throwers. If I see people warming up to throw the discus, for example, and they don't show anything where there's a twist involved in it, I generally start to worry, because there is quite a lot of force and twisting in the motion of throwing discus, and if they're not doing it, I'm thinking, it isn't there, why is it not there? So lots of these things could be built into a repertoire they can use for their warm-up for training, and of course at the same time they're building into their repertoire of the things they can do to warm up for the actual event or competition when they get there. So it's really good time, and time not to be wasted. after the warm-up, what does the rest of the session look like? So we've done some really good work in the warm-up. So the question really I'm asking what the rest of the session look like is, what do you do next? So we've got, go back to our original thing, we want to work on our movement patterns. We also want to develop the back of the circle, and we want to improve her explosiveness. So when do we do those things? I'm waiting to see something come up in the box, but I'm going to tell you if you don't know. So Spencer Duval is again typing. He's on fire tonight. It's obviously a long answer because it's still typing. So next one, it says back of the circle drill. So yes, Spencer, you've hit the nail on the head. So the next thing I would do after doing your warm-up is the technical work, because skills are best performed before fatigue sets in. And if they're competing in the summer, they won't be competing usually when they're fatigued. So it's about trying to do something when they're fresh. It's easier for them to do it. It's easier for them to retain it, and to do the technical work of progressing that back of the circle as we're working on here before they get tired. So what would then follow is you'd work on the skills that you're trying to do. So maybe doing turns, maybe doing drills with a weighted bar, maybe doing drills outside the circle, inside the circle, whatever it takes to try and improve that girl's conceptual understanding of what's required at the back of the circle. So that may be it. And then there would probably be some throwing as in, because that's what they come for. Try and get it into a throw, but quite a lot of work will be done at the back of the circle. You go through that. Then after the session's finished and you're working with numbers of athletes here, might be working on different technical aspects. Not surprisingly, different athletes turn up. They would probably be involved in some physical conditioning, and then a cool down. 360s, go through 360s. Well, 360s, I think for the back of the circle is a question there. So yes, they work on 360s. But I think some part of what they'd also want to do is to make sure their 360s are done properly. So if I had a pound for every time I saw someone do a 360 rotation on their foot at the back of the discus circle, for example, and do it incorrectly, I'd be quite rich. Because what they do is they lead with their upper body and they pull themselves around as if to lead with the heel and ankle of their left leg and getting around in a rotation that's led by the legs and feet rather than initiated with the upper body. So again, quite important. Cheryl's typing. We're going to wait and see what comes out of that. She might change her mind on the jam, maybe, I'm not sure. Right, so if we're waiting for that one to come in. So working at the back of the circle on the technique is kind of important, but it doesn't necessarily have to be done in the circle. I tend to do line work, my athletes, and balance work, and then take them back in the circle. So again, that's quite important that you can progress. The technical work can be done through that idea of progression. May not be able to get into the circle, only one person in the circle, only one time, but outside the circle, maybe if you work with an assistant coach, they could be working on other stuff, and they could do peer coaching too, to try and drill those things they're trying to do when they do get into the circle and they do get that chance to throw. So there's quite a lot of stuff. Not really that keen on seeing people standing outside the circle chatting. So either they're peer coaching the person in the circle, or they're working on drills together, or they're practicing their drills away from the circle. All right. So, and again, line work and tees. So I presume the tees work is with the upper body and keeping their arms out and working the legs at the time, and obviously having some linear aspect to the rotational throw if they were doing discus, or in fact, dare I say, hammer and shot would also come into that. So line working in 360s is written down there. So agreed. Again, it depends on where your athlete is and how they're progressing. So, for example, wouldn't necessarily have to be line work for someone who may only need to do the 360s, or vice versa. I go back to what I said at the beginning. Your athletes better than I do, and it depends where they are in their progression in the event is whether they do it or not. So, with more able athletes, might do. So got a suggestion from Nick again, superset throwing with physical exposure or technical at the back of the circle development challenges. So idea of perhaps doing some work and then perhaps adding in some explosiveness into that. That's quite good. Again, it depends on. I'd agree that's a good idea, but it depends on how demanding that explosiveness was. And we'd really looking here about quality during this time and not quantity. So again, you look at stuff that people do in terms of plyometrics. If that was involved, and oftentimes they had too many contacts, and for young kids, contacts, over 100 contacts in a session is getting into the realms of making it too difficult for them. Right, so the idea of that they're spending all that time, that technical work, doing stuff that's going to improve them technically, but also maybe address some of the physicality and the idea of that explosiveness. So shot glider band work, I'd agree with that. And again, you could do some resistance work with bungees as well. So that's true. I missed something there. Joe was still typing. So yes, my older athletes appear to need breakdown of movements in the circle sometimes. So we do that outside the circle. Good point. And good coaching, because you don't want people monopolizing the circle when they're not actually doing stuff that requires a circle. So if you're inside the cage, I would suggest you spend, if you've got a group of athletes, that should be reserved for throwing the implement, and outside the cage is for doing stuff without the implement, or just doing the drills or stuff without release. Right, so the other thing you may want to look at is that if you've done all that work, and not suggesting you can't do some physical work in there, but you may have time at the end where you're going to spend time almost focusing exclusively on that physical work. And again, the physical preparation will be planned in to accommodate the needs of your athletes. So I've written down there, just because it needs to be mentioned, the chronological or physical age, the intellectual age of the athletes, the biological age, whatever you want to call that, the training age too. So they may come with a great background and might be very robust already, but knowing your athletes is really important in this physical preparation side. And it may mean resistance, but it also may mean assistance. So, for example, excuse me, developing speed, you might want to get them run with a bungee, so they're being pulled towards you. So overspeed work, they might want to run down a slope, for example, to get their moving their legs quicker if they're doing some running. They might need to do similar running against resistance, so dragging a tire or towing a parachute if you've got one, those sort of things. But also you might have resistance in throwing, so heavier bags or cylinders of water or bags, whatever you're throwing might be done. So, but also saying here that we really want to look at progression, and you want to try and progress your athletes. Please understand that that's what we're trying to do here, but you also need to regress them at some point. So there's quite a number of stories about some fairly high level athletes who've come into athletics maybe from another sport and even achieve great things in another sport, but they can't stand on one leg because they don't have the stabilization through their hip girdle. So I think that there's quite a lot of stuff that we could do diagnostically too, to make sure that they can make that progression. And if they've got good movement patterns, which of course you've observed during the warm up and you've observed during the throwing, you can see the athletes making that progress. And athletes must, earn the right to progress. So a whole session without throwing is good for their stamina. It also shows there's a lot more to throwing than they thought. They can concentrate on different movements required. Yeah, so if you've got the luxury of having that in there, and again, you can do that during the period of time before they start doing the training. So what I described there as the getting fit stage is quite important. But simply speaking, if you've got no access to the circle, or you've got you've got another session that you don't need to do circle work, then I'd agree that doing some stuff, some hard work away from the circle is quite important, because I think sometimes people think you just get in there and throw. And I think the other thing about that, you're building not only stamina, but you're building endurance, you're building resilience in your athletes, so they can actually do hard work and may not enjoy it at the time, but they look back and think, well, I did work hard there. And the harder you work, the luckier you get. So some ideas and references and resources in this before we open up to some questions, because I realise it's 45 minutes has gone already. But there's a movement skills I'll try again, movement skills courses online, which you can do. There's physical prep course, which I'd highly recommend. There's a website I use called exrx.net, which actually, if you go in there, it'll give you virtually any weightlifting exercises, technically like weightlifting, not all exclusively weightlifting exercises, but for example, different types of squat, different types of lunge, different types of Romanian deadlift, different types of, so exrx.net is a really good. The other one I use on my iPad is iMuscle app, which again is started off originally as an anatomy app, but it's now developed into exercise and stuff like that. The first versions weren't that broad, but now it shows you variations on some of those movements, which will help with your progressions and regressions. And all of those things can be done without the use of a barbell. It can all be done with, either medicine balls, bags, balls, whatever it might, bags, bands, and all the rest of it. So another book which I did bring with me, I don't know what I've done with it, it's in here somewhere, is the book Stability Sport Performance Movement by John Elphiston, which is a good book. It shows lots of good ideas in there and what is the right way to go about it and the wrong way to go about it. I've got anything by Dan John. I really like his because he's very simplistic. He just talks about pretty much stuff to develop farmer strength, because as we know in throwing, there's no good being able to, bench press 205 kilos for 2 reps as someone I know and then throw 12 meters in the shot, because it's not the appropriate strength. It's strong, don't get me wrong, but where's the explosiveness in that? And I checked last night on Apple, and there's on the Apple App Store, there's 60 plus free apps available for ideas on exercise, and it's not necessarily you'd have to go them, because there's plenty of stuff on YouTube too, but you can look up stuff and say, well, actually that's pretty good, and I could adapt that to be useful for me to do something else related to throwing. Right, so some resistance ideas to throw this in: the medicine balls, resistance bands, kettlebells, power bags, water-filled containers, because you can't have access to all those things necessarily. With the water-filled containers, they can bring their own, they can take them away with them, and you can vary the weight of that as the session progresses. So, for example, with one of the athletes I work, he's got a 15 kilo drum. It's actually from a fish and chip shop, which had oil in it once upon a time. So it weighs 15 kilos when it's full, 15 litres, and he is able to tip out some of the water as he gets tired, and he then ends up doing the same exercises but with less resistance. And then assistance ideas about bungee, so being able to do over speed work, running down a hill as long as it's not too steep, so you're breaking the way down, using straps perhaps to assist in lifting up, so have them up, and for doing squats, and bands, so using bands instead of resistance bands but assistance bands for helping you get through the movement, to get those movement patterns right. So some ways in which you can progress and regress the exercises there, and also to improve speed. Any questions? So I've not really given enough time to this, so I'm hoping to give you at least 15 minutes, and are a bit short on that, for I apologise. But any questions that I can answer here or I've not made clear in my presentation? Yeah, so weighted jackets are good, and pulling sleds. Sleighs are really good, so sleigh pulling and pushing too. Weighted jackets, generally speaking, the rule about weighted jackets is it should be no more than 5% of their body weight. So if they're 100 kilos, the weight that you go in a weighted jacket would be 5 kilos. All right, so 5% of their body weight if you're going to do anything that requires quality of movement. But of course, if it's heavier than that, they can still use it, but you don't expect to have that quality or that explosiveness involved. So any of that stuff, generally building good robustness. Wrist weight's any good? I think I'm not saying no, because I don't know what they're necessarily used for, but I think wrist weights would be quite good if you're talking about getting an athlete to understand where their arms might be, because having that extra stuff sort of pulling them, it creates an awareness in them. So wrist weights can be used, and no issue with that, because you do the same by putting a weighted bar in their hand. So yes to that, and again, just because it creates an awareness they may not previously had. Of course, it's also providing some resistance. Right, so how do you prioritize the goals and So I prioritize the goals that I'm using with these athletes based on what they present to me. I prioritize them because, like, you might get an athlete who's physically quite robust and they're technically poor. So the priority would be to work on some of those technical aspects, and they may even be, still drilling while other people are doing the physical work. If you've got, the facility to be able to do that and supervise it. I think you need to prioritize first and foremost the physical and athletic attributes of the athlete. So there's no good trying to get a young athlete to throw further and further and further if, at some stage in the future they're going to break down because they're not physically robust enough. So I think you have to look at each athlete as an individual, but you also have to look at them holistically. There's no good use saying we're going to do this, 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 and this if they're not ready to do this. This activity you've got planned, and the ability to work and understand your own athlete is really important here. But I would assess them by having some measures in place. So again, on the rest weeks, which aren't really rest weeks, but they're much lower intensity, is we have jumps, quadrathlons. So if we're trying to assess how I've improved their explosiveness, for example, I would expect to see an improvement in their standing long jump or their vertical jump for height. All right, so I think that's quite important. So just going back, I've seen another question here. So assessing those, and of course you can assess how it's going, but you can also assess it on a less numerical scale by asking the athlete how they're feeling, how they think they're progressing, those sort of things. What does it feel like? Do they feel that there's improvement themselves? So how do you plan for psychological behavioural goals? Well, again, I think that's kind of inbuilt in this, and I don't necessarily include them if I was in it, but I do include them in my head as I go. So, for example, trying to persevere through making a technical change can be quite disheartening for someone. So, listening to what the athlete says and how they respond to the input you give them and the change they're trying to make are quite important. And you may need to build in a different session for them if you find that the situation is that they're feeling as though it's getting the better of them. So you need to be attuned to those things all the time. And again, like some part of the psychological and behavioural goals are achieved as a group by having that group ethos, being very supportive. I was training with a group today, and they're effectively having a mock competition, and it's quite interesting to see someone throw the javelin a little bit further than they've thrown before, and the rest of the group literally on their feet before it's landed, cheering because a lot of hard work went into that small change, and it is only a small change. But if you can get the rest of the group to be supportive in that way, I think you can help along in terms of building their sort of self-esteem and therefore building a more robust, psychologically robust athlete. But of course, part of athletics is about learning to deal with challenges and sometimes even failure, and meeting that with dignity and humility. And that's also learned through training, because there's always someone going to be better than you at something. So I missed anyone's message. So tapering phase during workout. So the tapering phase, which I haven't really spent a huge amount of time doing, was tapering occurs during the specifics period, where you reduce the volume of what you're doing and perhaps increase the intensity. So your weights and stuff will be coming down, and your throwing intensity will be going up. And you certainly, if you look at the way it's staged throughout, not tapering, but the chance to recover, those rest weeks are much lighter, because you've got to build in time for the athlete to be used to that. The other thing when you're talking about tapering is quite important, is that as you get further and further with athletes, you'll realise that every athlete works better off a different system. So again, a bit more towards sort of adult athletes, but some of the adult athletes I work with do really well off 5 sets of 5 on cleans, whereas other athletes in the similar sort of ability range work better off 5 sets of 3. But you can only know that when the athlete knows that and they get the feedback from their training. So knowing that is quite important. So yearly sample schedule for beginners. Well, some of what I've tried to do there is to try and give some idea of what you would do for a beginning group of throwers. So hopefully that's covered there. This will be available later on. Biggest thing I've learned from my planning is that I start off planning, and all the athletes I have all start with the same plan. It's called, an Excel spreadsheet. But what I do know is that the more I know my athletes and the better I know them in terms of working with them, the more individualized it becomes. So the biggest of things I've learned through planning is that it's never going to be one size fits all, and you have to meet the individual needs of those athletes as you go. And the other thing is that the biggest thing I've learned from planning apart from that is I've worked with more senior athletes and I've given them very extensive plans and stuff. And unfortunately, at times I've been duped into thinking, because they told me they've been doing all the stuff that's on the plan. So that was a fairly difficult lesson for me to learn and to recover from emotionally, because again, you're working with the idea of that trust between you and your athlete. Any other questions? Another message here, I'm trying to still read it. I missed someone's message here. Message. If there's a message I'm missing or someone, can they retype it? I suppose. How do you differentiate between athletes during a session? Right, so different athletes during the session might be as much as the number of reps they're going to do, the resistance they're going to have, the things they're going to work on. So there's no reason why, if you're doing a warm up, that some people might be doing, I don't know, lunges, some might be doing multi-directional lunges, some people might be doing backwards lunges. As long as they're doing a lunge pattern, and you can say to them, you do this, because you're trying to work on it. So the basics, they just work on a lunge and squat pattern, just the ordinary ones, whereas more advanced athletes could do other stuff. Doesn't mean they're not doing it, it's just mean they're doing different stuff in the same thing. So differentiating the resistance they use or the assistance they use, the number of reps they do. So I differentiate myself, because up to a few years ago I used to do the training with my athletes. So I 3 times 6 150s. I used to do 3 150s. I used to do every second one. I used to miss out the middle set. So I did 2 times 3 150s. But so I differentiated myself, because then I could still join in. Yeah, it took ages, but I still did it okay. All right, so it can be done. You can, of course, do that, because you differentiate for athletes all the time, because they don't turn up to your circle either and just do all the same stuff. You're trying to, because they don't have all the same technical needs. So we're actually really good at it. So I think sometimes people get a bit hung up about meeting individual needs, but we do it all the time. It's just about recognizing it. We need to do that in the circle and outside of the circle too. Apologies, folks. I'm trying to get through and make sure I answer everyone's questions. How do your athletes give others feedback? I do only give them a voice, what they think is right and wrong. Yeah, so I'm quite keen, just because I want to get future coaches too. I'm quite keen for athletes to be peer coaches. I don't expect them to necessarily diagnose, but I expect them to be able to spot a movement. So if it's on a squat pattern, is there a parallel between their shins and their back? That's something they could easily observe, and then therefore they know what a good squat pattern looks like. But certainly speaking, in the turn or in approach work, they don't need to know whether it's right or wrong, but what were they doing with their feet on the approach and the javelin? How were their feet working? And then you again, about building that trust and that sort of group ethos, is that people would appreciate that, because with the best will in the world, I can only watch one thing when they're throwing. I can't watch everything. So asking someone else for feedback, or someone else using a video, or building that, if you like, as I saw today, this sort of ethos where they celebrate each other's steps forward and movement, comes quite good. But I think what I would say, and I think you're alluding to there, Gerald, is that they've got to have their trust in you, and you trust in them to be honest with their feedback, and also to hear what they like and they dislike. And my coaching has moved from certainly working with young kids, you do this, and this, and you do it now, kind of thing, to working with some of the athletes I work with now. It says, how does that feel? What do you think worked well for you there? Why do you think that was? And you don't actually have to do a huge amount of coaching, because they can coach themselves and they know what they did wrong. And it's much easier for them to tell you that they felt something wasn't good, and for you to do it, rather than say you didn't do this, because it's a much more positive way to deal with it. So the point you're making there, Cheryl, is a really good one. But just by asking the athletes, because we're trying to make them students of the event too. You know, we don't want automatons. We want people who are able to think for themselves, to feel for themselves, and know those self-corrections, because we're the best one in the world. I can't be every athlete I'm coaching. I can't be there when they're competing. They have to be able to do it for themselves. So thank you for raising that. If I missed anyone's question, I do apologise for that.